Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have gathered here to celebrate our Foundation Day. It is a matter of great honor and privilege for us at Panjab University to have Professor Romila Thapar, an illustrious scholar and alumna of this university, as the speaker on this historic occasion. Our university is celebrating the 130th year of its existence. This year is unique because the partition of 1947 now lies at the hinge of our history, bisecting it at 65 years pre- and post-independence. You will be happy to know that this entire program is being streamed live globally through the PU website and is also being covered live by our own radio station Jyotirgamay 91.2. On stage we have the speaker of the day, eminent historian Professor Romila Thapar, Professor P Bambah, eminent mathematician and our former Vice Chancellor, Professor A Grover, Vice Chancellor, Professor Kohli, DUI, Professor B Brar, Chairman of the Steering Committee, Professor A Bhandari, the Registrar, Professor Devi Sirohi, Coordinator of the Foundation Day Lecture, and Professor Arun Grover, Dean Alumni Relations. I request the Chairman of the Foundation Day Steering Committee, Professor B Brar, to present the welcome address. Professor Brar, please.
Professor Romila Thapar, Professor Grover, Vice Chancellor, distinguished colleagues and friends, this is indeed a very special day for Panjab University. It was a poet who said, "What are we but our memories and our dreams?" And I think institutions very much are like human beings in a certain sense. An institution must have a sense for its historicity. We have an eminent historian, therefore, for the first foundation lecture. We must have a vision for the future, which is what we are discussing later in the afternoon. It's a combination of memories and dreams, all past, present, and future, that makes an institution alive. I think this is a day on which we are making a very important beginning by commemorating Foundation Day of the University. Foundation Day of the University might be compared to an important anniversary in our personal lives. That's the day when we look back. That's the day when we assess what we have done in the past, very well and not so well. That's the time when we make promises to ourselves and we take pledges. I think a Foundation Day, which will be now celebrated every year, will be that day on which we'll do all this. As chairman of the steering committee for this function, I welcome all of you and I express my thanks to Professor Grover, our Vice Chancellor, for giving me this very important and very pleasant duty to perform. So on behalf of all members of the steering committee, and they've worked ceaselessly in the last 15-20 days, on their behalf and on my own behalf, I welcome you all. I'm sure that you will find the commemoration and the programs involved in the commemoration enjoyable. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you, sir. I now request our Vice Chancellor, Professor A. Grover, to please honor our special guest, Professor Romila Thapar. Thank you, sir. The Dean University Instructions, Professor R.K. Kohli, is requested to honor Professor Bambah, our former Vice Chancellor and a renowned mathematician. Thank you, sir. I now request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Grover, to address the gathering.
Good morning to all of you. Two most eminent icons on the dais, the invited speaker, Professor Romila Thapar ji, and a mentor of all of us, Professor P Bambah ji, the Chairperson of the Steering Committee, Professor B.S. Baraj, DY Professor R.K. Kohli, Registrar Professor A.K. Bhandari, all the special entities in the audience, which include the former Vice Chancellors, former DUIs, former Registrars of PU, Emeritus Professors of PU, present and past Senate members of PU, principals of all the affiliated colleges, heads of research and academic institutions in and around Chandigarh, my teaching colleagues, young researchers, student representatives, distinguished alumni, prominent citizens, ladies and gentlemen. I consider it a rare fortune and privilege to greet and welcome all of you on the occasion of First Punjab University Foundation Day public lecture on behalf of the entire university fraternity. I am feeling doubly blessed today. 3.5 years ago, I welcomed at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai, the atomic energy community on the occasion of the first TIFR Foundation Day lecture delivered by Dr. Anil Kakotkar during the birth centenary year of Dr. Romila Thapar. The conception of that motion has served the purpose of revisiting the mandate and the vision of Dr. Bhabha once every year to reaffirm our commitment to the pursuit of excellence. During the last 4 years, a national icon has addressed the young university students visiting Mumbai from all over India in the month of June. The annual TIFR Foundation Day has thus assumed the role of an engagement with the young researchers in all fields of science. I was indeed delighted that my colleagues here accepted my proposal to initiate an annual Punjab University Foundation Day lecture from October this year. Punjab University came into being at Lahore on October 14, 1882. And after the trauma of the partition of India, it was reinitiated in independent India on October 1, 1947. The university completed 65 years after independence earlier this month, thus equaling 65 years gone by at Lahore. It is envisaged to construct a foundation monument at a central place in our present campus. Hopefully, as the students and visitors pass by that monument, it would arouse their curiosity to explore with some passion the rich heritage of Punjab University. I have been personally enjoying doing so ever since my arrival here in a new role 3 months ago. Historically, the first 3 universities in India established at Calcutta, Bombay and Madras in 1857 predate the Punjab University Lahore by 25 years. However, the Punjab University is the first one which assumed roles of teaching and research in addition to being an examination and regulatory body for the affiliated colleges attached to universities established prior to Punjab University. The legacy of PU represents today the aspirations and achievements of people in our part of the Indian subcontinent to grow as a modern society in the community of nations globally. The proceedings of today's engagements also include the unveiling of a plaque by the invited speaker in this inaugural session. This plaque will get embedded in the foundation monument. In the afternoon session today, we shall take cognizance of the progress being made towards the realization of a wonderful vision for the university articulated by some of the best minds of our university about 5 years ago. May I conclude my brief address by first thanking Professor Romila Thapar, Professor Bambah, and Shri Pawan Kumar Bansal ji, the Union Minister for Parliamentary Affairs and Senator and alumnus of Punjab University, who would join us a little later in this session. I also gratefully acknowledge Professor Barar and his team and many others in the university who have tirelessly worked towards realization of different aspects of the first annual Punjab University Foundation Day commemorations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Professor P Bambah has graciously accepted to join us in this celebration and to preside over this session. I request you, sir, to please address the gathering.
Professor Thapar, Professor Grover, Professor Puri, Professor Pathak, Professor Gosal, other distinguished friends and colleagues. The idea of having a Founders' Day is something which is very wonderful, because this gives us a time to introspect, to plan, to think, to assess, to reassess the goals that have been set for us by ourselves and the others, how we have achieved them, how much we have achieved them, how far we are from them. We have a vision document prepared by Professor Soti and his colleagues, which we'll be discussing in the afternoon. It is very appropriate that the first Foundation Day should be addressed by an eminent alumnus who is a distinguished historian. Professor Thapar, as you know, is one of the pioneers who have made it possible to look at Indian history from a new perspective. When we were students, we learned history as chronicle of dynasties, emperors, individuals, their ambitions, their rivalries, their vanities. That we are living in a history, in a society which has been evolving, was never brought out. We never thought of the social forces, means of production, the progression of means of production, the changing means of production, the interplay of societal forces which form the evolution of a society. All one thought of was Akbar was great because he did this thing, and Ashoka was great, and somebody else was not so great because he didn't conquer enough. But that history is not those people. History is people, societies, their movements, their changes. Now these are the things that small group of people, Kosambi, R S Sharma, Romila Thapar, brought out for the ancient period, and then later for other periods other people have worked. And so that now we think that history is us, not the kings and emperors. History is what has shaped us, shaped the country in which we live in, shaped the means of living that we have been provided, the shortcomings that we have, and so on. And we are very grateful that Professor Thapar has agreed to come and address us today. We had the privilege of listening to her earlier also in the late 80s. And at that time made the mistake of having a lecture in the Gandhi Bhavan, which is a small auditorium. And I remember how difficult it was to control the people in the corridors and outside and so on. And I am sure that you are in for a great treat today. Thank you very much for asking me to preside over these functions. As usual, the person presiding is much less distinguished than the person who is going to address. But I am grateful that because of my seniority in age, perhaps, you are given this honor to go over. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. University's Architect Office, with expert guidance of Architect P R Luthra, former Chief Architect of Punjab, has designed a monument which will be constructed to commemorate this day. I request Professor Thapar to please oblige us and unveil the plaque of the University monument, which is kept on the left side of the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, the plaque reads, Punjab University, set up 65 years before India's independence, thrived as a leading center of learning in the entire subcontinent. The trauma of partition in 1947 put its resilience to the severest test. 65 years later, the university looks back at its record of glorious resurgence with pride. Thank you very much, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, I draw your attention to the design of the university monument that is being displayed on the screens. The hexagonal structure will stand tall. It will be surrounded by a beautifully landscaped garden with a pathway leading up to the monument. The top view of the design shows the conceptual scheme with 3 white marble pedestals on black granite hexagon, 2 of them representing the 2 phases of our growth, 65 years of Punjab University before independence and 65 after. This is the front view of the monument. Notice the 3rd block with the plaque. On a closer look of the 3rd block, we notice a curved form reaching skywards, depicting our growth and flourishing status of Punjab University. The pedestal walls have been designed with significant architectural detailing. There are 65 grooves at an inclination of 65 degrees, symbolizing the glorious past of 65 years before and 65 after independence, one step representing 1 year of growth. Water flows through the undulations on the inclined surface of the granite, giving serenity to the structure while keeping the monument clear of dust. On the 2 pedestals are embossed the emblems adopted by Punjab University before and after independence. Notice the radial movements of the lines on the floor. Alumni walking out of the portals of the university go freely into the world in all directions and are yet remain connected in their roots which lie here. The university, while wishing them farewell, also tells them that they are not forgotten. Ladies and gentlemen, after this beautiful tour into the future and magically also into the past, we return. It is time now for the most awaited event of the day, the Foundation Day lecture by Professor Romila Thapar. Although our speaker needs no introduction, yet we would be delighted to hear about the remarkable accomplishments of our alumna. I request Professor Devi Sirohi, the coordinator of the Foundation Day lecture, to introduce the speaker.
It is a matter of great honor and privilege for us at the Punjab University to have Professor Romila Thapar, an illustrious scholar and alumna of this university, as the speaker on the important occasion of the Foundation Day. After graduating from Punjab University, Professor Thapar earned her doctorate under late A.L. Basham at the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London, in 1958. She then worked as Professor of Ancient Indian History at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where she is Professor Emeritus. Professor Thapar is an honorary fellow at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. She holds honorary doctorates from the University of Chicago, the Institute National des Languages et Civilisations Orientales in Paris, the University of Oxford, the University of Edinburgh, the University of Calcutta, and recently from the University of Hyderabad. In 2004, the US Library of Congress appointed her as the first holder of the Club Chair in Countries and Cultures of the South. She was elected a foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2009. Professor Romila Thapar has had the distinction of being listed twice amongst the very prestigious Padma awardee by the Government of India. Some of Professor Thapar's major works are Ashok and the Decline of the Mauryas, Ancient Indian Social History, Some Interpretations, Recent Perspectives of Early Indian History, A History of India, Early India from the Origins to AD 1300, Cultural Pasts, Essays in Early Indian History, From Lineage to State, Social Formations of the Mid-First Millennium BC in the Ganges Valley. Professor Thapar has also edited several anthologies such as Situating Indian History for Sarvepalli Gopal, Indian Tales, India Another Millennium, Communalism and the Writing of Indian History. It is a matter of great privilege to now request Professor Romila Thapar to deliver the very first Punjab University Foundation Day lecture titled Interpretation of Early Indian History. Thank you.
That was a good beginning, but obviously technology is against me. I'll start again. Mr. Vice Chancellor, Professor Bambah, and friends, may I begin by expressing my very, very deep appreciation for this invitation. I little thought, being 52, that one day I would be sitting here delivering the foundation lecture for the Panjab University. But it is both a matter of appreciation and I feel very humble in doing so. One always feels humble when one is associated with one's alma mater. I came to Panjab University slightly by accident, although the entire family, my family, is Panjab University educated from Lahore. But I came to Panjab University as a bit of an accident because I was starting my degree in Pune and I'd done 2 years, and then my father was transferred to Delhi, And Delhi University said to me, we have a different system. You have to repeat your BA from the first year all over again. And I thought, I can't possibly spend 5 years doing a BA. So my uncle, Mr. P Thapar, who was then posted to Shimla, said to me, why don't you come to Shimla and do your degree from Panjab University? You'll be able to do it in the stipulated 4 years. So I went to Shimla and joined the Bhargav Municipal College, which, alas, doesn't exist anymore. Some friends of mine have therefore been teasing me and saying, are you sure you went to college in the Punjab University? Where is that college now? But apart from that, I'm also delighted. It's a double pleasure and a privilege for me to be not only giving this lecture, not only my association with Panjab University, but also my association with Chandigarh. Because I don't think there would be many people in this audience who would remember the landscape of Chandigarh before the city was built. I was made familiar with it by the simple fact that when Le Corbusier arrived in Delhi, I knew a little bit of French, and so my uncle sent me to meet him and make him feel comfortable by having somebody speak in French. And then he came down to fetch Corbusier, and as it happened, myself to come up to Simla and study at the BM College. On the way, we stopped at this landscape, and it was pointed out to Corbusier that this is where the city was going to be located. So I had this fascinating morning of trailing around behind them, listening to this entire conversation of the orientation of the city, how it was to be developed, etc., etc. And now when I come back and I see what Chandigarh has become, I'm both pleased as well as a little apprehensive, because I think it's going the way of all cities in this country, and one is desperately looking around for where is Le Corbusier in all of this. But hopefully the people of Chandigarh will find him eventually, and he will surface very much as a part of the city. But so much for my very genuine pleasure at having been invited, and I would like to thank the university once again for doing so. I thought that I would speak about the way we have interpreted Indian history, the kinds of incarnations that it has gone through, early Indian history, ancient Indian history if you like, the incarnations it has gone through in the last couple of 100 years. Because it has changed very much, and I believe has changed for the better. But that's for you to judge. At the time of Indian independence, we had inherited a history of the subcontinent contoured by two substantial views of the past, the colonial and the nationalist. Both views were primarily concerned with chronology and with sequential narratives. The focus was on those in power, a focus that has been basic to much historical writing. There was information on the action of kings and dynasties, on governors general and viceroys, and on various national leaders. On these there was broad agreement. What was contested, although partially, was the colonial representation of Indian society. The colonial view was a departure from any earlier Indian historical traditions and drew on European preconceptions of Indian history. The use of history to legitimize power had changed from the rule of dynasties to colonial and nationalist definitions of power. Three arguments were foundational to the colonial view of Indian history. The first was a periodization that was to have not only historiographical consequences, but a major political fallout in the 20th century.
I am referring to the fact that Indian history was divided into what was called the Hindu and then the subsequent Muslim civilization and the British period, as formulated by the British historian James Mill in his History of British India, published in 1880. These labels, Hindu, Muslim and British, were taken from the religion of the ruling dynasties, first the Hindu and then the Muslim. The divisions were endorsed by the assumption that the units of Indian society were monolithic religious communities, primarily the Hindu and the Muslim, and that these were mutually hostile. This was a given statement. Religion was believed to have superseded all other identities. This periodization also projected an obsession with the idea that Indian society had never changed throughout its history. It was a static society. The second assertion was that the pre-colonial political economy through the centuries conformed to the model of what was called Oriental despotism. This again assumed a static society, characterized by an absence of private property in land, despotic and oppressive rulers, and therefore endemic poverty. A static society meant that it lacked a sense of history, since history records change, and consequently they argued that there was no historical writing in pre-modern India. The third aspect was that Hindu society was said to have always been divided into four main castes, the four Varnas. These had been rigidly separated because they represented the diverse races of the subcontinent. The identification of caste with race resulted from current European ideas of what was called race science in the 19th century, and the labeling of people by racial labels. This is, of course, a science which has been given up completely now. This caste organization of society was rooted in what was seen as the Aryan foundations of Indian civilization. And in defining civilization, Sanskrit was viewed as its dominant language, and the hegemonic religion was Vedic Brahmanism. Above all, the attempt was to project India as alien, the other of Europe. Colonial interpretations claimed to be applying the criteria of Enlightenment rationality in their reconstruction of the history of the colony. But in fact, they were imposing a history that suited the requirements of colonial dominance. These preconceptions, together with a focus on chronology and the narrative of dynasties, governed routine history. Colonial historians drew on texts reflecting the upper caste perspectives of Indian society. Many of the Indian historians themselves, coming from the newly emerged middle class, were of the upper castes and familiar with these texts. And by and large, they continued this routine because they were not very comfortable with questioning what they regarded as the sacred texts of the past. Nevertheless, there was a debate, especially among historians influenced by nationalist ideas. The colonial periodization was generally accepted. A few historians changed the nomenclature from Hindu, Muslim and British to ancient, medieval and modern, borrowed from Europe and thought to be perhaps a little more secular, although the markers of the change remained the same, and in effect, therefore, there was very little change. Oriental despotism as a system of political economy was naturally rejected by the more nationalist Indian historians. Curiously, however, there was little interest in providing alternative hypotheses on the early Indian economy and society. This interest in social and economic history began relatively late. Social history in standard works largely reiterated the description of the four castes as given in the normative texts, the Dharmashastras. There was little recognition of how the system actually worked, with its many deviations from the norm. The predominant form of nationalism, described as anti-colonial and secular, was beginning to be imprinted on Indian historical writing from the early 20th century. But parallel to this, and initially less apparent in historical writing, were the two religious nationalisms, Hindu and Muslim, both emerging at about the same time in the early 20th century. Both had been deeply influenced by the colonial projection of monolithic, segregated communities of either Hindus or Muslims in the past. Such nationalisms were not essentially anti-colonial. They were more interested in using history to legitimize their political ideology of religion-based nationalism in order to endorse the political mobilization that they sought. Muslim religious nationalism came to define the identity of Pakistan. Hindu religious nationalism is still seeking a parallel identity for India. The chickens of the colonial policy had come home to roost. The need to examine history in terms of a substantially different set of parameters was being suggested by other writing. The prehistory of the social sciences, as it were, in India, had begun in discussions around the nature of Indian society and the cause of economic poverty. Economists such as the famous Dadabhai Naoroji had maintained that the colonial economy drained the wealth of India, and that was the real source of Indian poverty. This raised heated controversies over the nature of the colonial economy, which eventually also encouraged studies of the economies of pre-colonial times. Sorting out the strands of the caste structure and its social implications was evident in the writings of sociologists such as D.P. Mukherjee and M.K. Bose, who were unfreezing the theoretical pattern. Describing the actual reality of caste led to recognizing how it differed from the Dharmashastra norms. The normative view was implicit to the then vision of Indian civilization, where caste tied to the conventional reading of the religion was seen as the enduring feature. B.R. Ambedkar, writing on caste, projected his Dalit awareness back into history. He wrote on the history of the Shudras and the Dalits. For him, the social hierarchy of caste was not just a matter of ritual status and difference, but was linked, as indeed it was, to domination and subordination. And he argued that confrontations and revolts by the lowest against the highest were prevented only because the intermediate castes intervened. But such views were not discussed in studies of social history until much later. Among the more influential colonial representations of world history at that time was the division of the world into discrete civilizations. Each civilization was demarcated territorially and associated with a single language and a single religion. And although this approach has been challenged by historians, Even now, Arnold Toynbee's 26 civilizations have nearly been replaced by Samuel Huntington's 8, and the out-of-date notion of the world being divided into civilizations persists, as well as that world history can be studied as just a collection of civilizations. The counterpart to those regarded as civilized was, of course, those described as non-civilized. Colonial definitions identified caste Hindus as the civilized, and the others, such as forest dwellers, pastoralists, and so on, as less civilized and labeled as primitive. And unfortunately, this label and its connotations persists today at the popular level. Cultural nationalism was influenced by colonial readings of Indian civilization and the Indian response to these. Few attempted to investigate the complexities and multiple variations of pre-colonial articulations of culture. The powerful intellectual debates of ancient times in India between the orthodox and the heterodox, the theories of knowledge that resulted, were treated by historians nearly as religious sectarian discourse. That these earlier discussions had drawn on a wide spectrum of thought ranging across belief, mysticism, rational and logical reasoning, some approaching seemingly dialectical ways, and had recorded fundamental differences in dissent, was rarely explored by historians. Cultural nationalism, therefore, stayed close to the contours dictated by colonial preconceptions. The notion of cultural heritage was colored by colonial hierarchies. The claims frequently made by groups today to some traditions and identities being authentic, indigenous, unchanging, and eternal pose immense problems for the contemporary historian. Identities are neither timeless and unchanging, nor homogeneous nor singular, as maintained in the 19th century concept of civilization. In every society, identities are multiple. A particular identity, be it religion, language, caste, ethnicity, or whatever, has relevance to particular situations and events. Historians cannot pick one identity as primary for all time and for all situations. Cultural nationalism today resonates in many parts of the world and claims to draw on early histories. It is sometimes rather embarrassing when this claim to early history is made and the claim is really not historically justifiable. This happens right across the world. Understanding how this nationalism is constructed therefore requires a critical inquiry into pre-modern history, as some historians are now attempting. The questioning of existing theories about the past began to be more distinctly formulated in the 1950s and the 1960s, and gradually altered the historical criteria of analysis. New questions began to be asked about the early past. This widened the range of sources, moving from texts to archaeology to even scientific sources of various kinds. It also led to some distancing from both the colonial and the nationalist interpretations of Indian history. There was an appreciation of earlier scholarship, but since knowledge is not chronos-free, not free of its time context, it has to be related to a specific situation and time. This is all the more so where a shift in paradigm is involved. where the frame of reference is being realigned. And in part, this shift had to do with questions related to the broader issues concerning the Indian nation-state from the 1950s. Emerging from a colonial situation, the initial question at the time of independence was how the new nation was to be shaped. It was thought that a better understanding of this could provide a prelude to current concerns. These concerns included extensive discussions on economic growth, the establishing of a greater degree of social equality, and comprehending the potential of a multiple cultural heritage. Some of you may remember the discussions that went on in the 1960s and 70s on these subjects. Inevitably, this also led to the questioning of the view of history that had been constructed in the last 200 years. This in turn introduced information about aspects of the past that had not been researched earlier. The questions were not limited to politics and the economy, but extended to social forms, cultural and religious expression, and, very important, the formation of identities and what we call traditions. A new topic of interest was research into historiography, which meant analyzing the views of historians as part of the process of writing history. In questioning existing explanations, the validity of periodizing history as Hindu, Muslim, and British was increasingly doubted. The question asked was, can we posit 2,000 years of a golden age for the first, the Hindu period, 800 years of despotic tyranny for the second, the Muslim period, and a supposed modernization under the British? Such divisions were set aside the relevance of significant changes within these lengthy periods. That any age stretching over a long period can be described as consistently glorious or tyrannical was questioned, as also the characterization of an age merely by the behavior and the religion of its rulers. These doubts were encouraged when history became more than just a study of dynasties and chronology. There was also the realization that communities and religions are not monolithic. They are segmented and fragmented into sects and groups. Each of these has its own varying relationships with others. And the history of religions, ranging from social practice and ritual to belief and ideology, is a very complex study. It is not easy to make generalizations about religious history. It has to be constantly correlated with the particular social group that constitutes its patrons and its supporters. Alternate notions of periodization, different from the colonial Hindu, Muslim, British periods, were in part a reaction to the opening up of a dialogue between history and other disciplines. The interface between the past and the present encouraged the notion that earlier historical experience could provide insights into some contemporary phenomena. Historians also began to look at the way in which other disciplines, especially those of the social sciences, studied aspects of society. This was particularly useful, for instance, in trying to reconstruct societies from archaeological data, which now was no longer limited to just a list of objects. Linguistics, and more particularly historical linguistics, was another new source of evidence. Both archaeology and linguistics suggested new orientations. Coinciding with these changes came the establishing of other disciplines within the social sciences: economics, sociology, anthropology, human geography, demography, to mention the more obvious, with a much-needed focus on Indian problems as particular and specific. Ancient history, when seen as a social science, developed new orientations, different from its earlier inclusion as Indology. There was the growing recognition that the past had to be not just known, but explained, understood, reinterpreted on the basis of what historians were now referring to as a historical method involving a critical inquiry. This mention of historical method reminds me of a time when I was a visiting professor at the Indian Institute of Science and was giving some lectures on Indian history, and I began the first lecture by saying that I was going to speak about historical method. And 6 hands went up and said, "We all know about the scientific method, but what is a historical method? How can history have a method?" So I had to explain to them that history also has a method and a way of analysis. The reliability of the evidence, this is part of the historical method, the reliability of the evidence and the logic of the argument continued to have the primacy that they had had earlier. But now there was a wider explanation of the historical context, and such explanations could also help in understanding the present in a more focused way than before. Meanwhile, an altogether different approach to ancient history, specifically ancient and medieval history, that was initially marginal, but which has now been revived as the ideology of religious nationalisms, was and is the reverse of mainstream history. In this approach of religious nationalist history, the investigation of the past depicts an almost ideal ancient society, attractive, of course, to current popular imagination. The reconstruction of this past is not based on analyzing data, but on a return to some of the more popular colonial theories of the Indian past. There is an insistence on distinctive Hindu and Muslim periods of history and the innate hostility of the two communities. Everything is explained in terms of the antagonism of the two communities. Hindu society has to be based, it is argued, on what are projected as purely Aryan indigenous foundations. And these days, of course, DNA analysis is also dragged into this discussion. Now, some of us have problems with this because Aryan is in fact not a racial term, it's a language term. And more correctly, it should be the Aryan-speaking people. And if it's not a biological entity but a cultural entity, which a language is, then many people of many biological origins can be speaking the same language, as indeed many people of diverse biological origins, or of the same biological origins, can be speaking diverse languages. So it's a conflation of two totally different concepts. The Indian identity, according to this view, is believed to be monolithic and uniform for all time. The claim is made that this is indigenous Indian history, whereas the history that uses a critical inquiry is a Western imposition on Indian history. What is interesting about this whole development is partly historiographical. I'm interested in the idea that in many parts of the world, in erstwhile colonized areas, people appropriate the narrative of the colonial interpretation in the aftermath of their own writing of independent history. This is curious, and it does require analysis. Comparative studies of the historiography of ex-colonies might be illuminating to such an analysis. Its significance lies in the politics of the present, for in terms of furthering the exploration of the past, it has little to contribute. Let me return now to mainstream history and the exploration of knowledge which brought about a shift of paradigm in the historical writing of ancient India. It involved not only asking a different set of questions from historical sources, but also the use of new methods of analysis that were under discussion in many of the social sciences. For many of us, the 1960s and 70s, at the universities where we were teaching, were times when historians were eager to explore the earlier history of a variety of themes. These related to social, economic, and cultural history, and triggered off new directions in research. Some explanations of the past arose from hitherto unnoticed evidence, or freshly discovered evidence, as for instance from archaeology. There was a huge expansion and spurt of archaeological excavation after 1947. But more generally, these questions arose from new inquiries into existing evidence, a recognized process in the advancing of knowledge. This in turn requires the use of the historical method of investigation, as well as some interest in comparative history. How do different societies record their histories, and what are their histories written, what is written about their histories? I would like at this point to consider some examples of the kind of historical themes that have attracted historians of early India in recent decades. The concept of the nation had run into confusion with the two-nation theory central to the creation of Pakistan and India, and the insistence on religious identities being primary historical identities. The clarification did not lie in taking the concept of nation back to ancient times, which of course is not possible, it's a modern concept, as some were suggesting, but in differentiating between nation and state. The concept of the nation-state emerged in the colonial period, but the idea of the state had primacy in the early past, although it took various forms. These had to be differentiated. A centrally administered kingdom had been assumed to be the basis of all states in pre-modern times, and the breakup of these was equated with political decline. Empires, however, were the order of the day in the 19th century, particularly with British historians, who saw the British Empire as the successor to the Roman. Every important dynasty was therefore described as empire, as it is still to this day. There are so many kingdoms that are empires that you think, my goodness, our history was just a succession of empires. The study of political forms and the likelihood of variation in patterns of power gradually led to demarcating various polities. Clan-based societies with chiefs, generally agro-pastoral, such as the Gana Sanghas and the Gana Rajyas, were thought of as prior to the kingdom. Before you got the kingdom, you had these chiefdoms. Kingdoms as state systems demonstrated greater complexity of organization. The transition from clan-based polities to kingdoms has been seen as seminal to the societies as described in the Vedic sources, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, as well as in the Pali Buddhist canon. Historical analyses are, of course, complicated by the fact that these variant forms do not move in linear fashion and are not uniform in space and time. But these studies will hopefully shift the obsession from the discussion on the origin and identity of the Aryans as the Aryan foundations of Indian civilization to broader and more relevant questions. Those being currently debated concern the nature of social change, the interface between multiple cultures, remembering that all of early Indian history is a history of multiple cultures, and mechanisms of legitimizing power. When the structure of the state began to be discussed, it led to a focus on the typology of state systems. How does a state come into existence at different times? This has now become a focused study in which the state is not something distinct from society. The nature of the formation of states suggested variations that made early states different from later ones. Thus, the Mauryan state of the 4th century BC was not identical with that of the Guptas, who ruled in the 4th century AD, and historians have to point out the difference. The discussion on varied forms had implications for the definition of empire as well, as is evident in the study of administration. It can be asked whether the Mauryan Empire was a highly centralized bureaucratic system, as most of us had argued in our earlier writing, including myself, or can it be seen as a more diversified system, as some of us have argued in our later writings, including myself again. The tension between control from the center and assertion of local autonomy has been a recurring feature and is now beginning to be commented upon. The regular use of the term empire for all kingdoms has come in for questioning, with kingdom being differentiated from empire. Religion was an unlikely primary factor in the initial emergence of the state. But when there was the need for the welding of segments into an empire, as in the policies of Ashok Maurya and Akbar, there was recourse to certain facets of religion among other things. And these facets need historical analysis. The confrontation between the chiefdoms, the Ganasanghas, and the kingdoms, the Rajyas, earlier referred to in passing, is now eliciting greater interest. Their divergent ideologies are being recognized. Arguments and counter-arguments among the intellectuals of those times, and I'm talking about 500 BC to 500 AD, were part of the urban experience. In the Buddhist texts, for example, they talk about teachers holding forth and preaching their ideas in the parks on the edges of cities. And these were called, very interestingly, the Kutuhalashala, the place for raising curiosity. And I feel that universities today really should call themselves Kutuhalashalas. Earlier studies had noted that orthodox views were challenged by the heterodox. The heterodox are referred to by the Brahmins as the Nastika, the unbelievers, and the Pashanda, the frauds. And the so-called heretics also used the same epithets for the Brahmins when the debate became fierce. Such discussions as, for example, the divergent views on social ethics, typified, for example, by the ethics of the Bhagavad Gita on the one hand and the ethics of Ashok Maurya on the other, the difference is now being recognized as significant and requiring a closer analysis of the text within the context of its times. From the colonial perspective, the primary economy of India was the agrarian economy. Comparatively less interest was shown in the many dimensions of urban culture. The latter has received considerable attention in recent historical studies. Urbanization in the Ganga plain in the 6th, 5th centuries BC was linked to the emergence of state systems through changes in technology and administration. The currently debated question is the role of iron technology in this first urbanization of the 5th century BC. The investigation of the state as a process has focused on its location in terms of environment, resources and demography, as well as its potential as a center for the exchange of goods and a hub of administration. Exchange in varying forms from barter to commerce coexisted for many centuries, and for which there is a spurt of evidence from the post-Mauryan period provided an additional economic dimension. The study of coins is no longer limited to simply fine-tuning the chronology of rulers. It has introduced preliminary notions of money and markets at exchange centers. A study of market centers in South India, for example, in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, raises a question of whether trade could be a reason for the change from clan-based society to kingship amongst the earliest Cheras, Cholas and Pandyas. This would suggest the evolution of kingdoms from a different set of causal factors as compared to the middle Ganga plain. Process to other parts of Asia was known through overland trade. Maritime connections have now come to the forefront, underlining new cultural and intellectual intersections. The perspective on the Indian past, earlier viewed largely from the Himalaya and the Hindu Kush mountains, is now extended to include the very different perspective from the Indian Ocean to the south. Increasing evidence of maritime connections has also raised questions linked to complex commercial arrangements. In the period just prior to European expansion, the commercial orbit of Afro-Asian trade ran from Tunis in North Africa to Canton in South China. The commerce crossed state boundaries and involved elements of what we would today call international trade and investments. Half-serious comments, therefore, are being made on globalization before globalization. More seriously, this questions the validity of the idea of segregated, isolated civilizations. The possibility of bilingualism in some regions, such as Greek and Prakrit in the northwest of India, which is attested to by inscriptions, or Sanskrit and Javanese in Indonesia, suggests re-examining the cross-currents in many cultures, especially now that cultures are known to be porous. Historians in many parts of the world have discussed and continue to do so, sometimes raising huge controversies and major debates. They've continued to discuss the theories that explain historical events and their interpretations. In India, there was initially an interest in the writings of Karl Marx, Max Weber, and the French sociologists and historians of what was called the Annales school, all of whom had commented on the Indian past to a greater or lesser degree in the 19th century and the early 20th century. For Karl Marx and Max Weber, two very different kinds of thinkers, India was alien and therefore the other of Europe. Each theory provided alternate explanations for why there was this difference. Historians debated these explanations, although the debates were not conclusive. But in the process, aspects of the past that had earlier seemed closed to the historian were made visible, and the discussion brought what were thought to be peripheral subjects into the mainstream of history. The centrality of social and economic history was evident in all these theories of explanation. Methods of analysis influenced by historical materialism were adapted by some, but with the caveat that the Indian data was likely to suggest variant patterns. This is clearly demonstrated in the work of Didi Kosambi, which gave a new dimension to the study of ancient history. One may not agree with all his generalizations, but his analysis was methodologically rigorous and at the same time innovative, but reliably so. Marxist historical writing introduced the idea of modes of production, which further altered periodization. Marx's notion of an Asiatic mode of production, a variant on the old Oriental despotism idea, was largely rejected by Indian Marxists. So too was the slave mode of production. This had been based on studies of ancient Greece and Rome. Comparisons with Indian data were attempted, but the model was found untenable. However, the possibility of a feudal mode of production and the debate on the transition to capitalism captured historical interest in India. The notion of feudalism had initially drawn on European parallels, but now the discussion centered on the Marxist model. Significantly, the criticism of applying the feudal mode to India was also initiated by Marxist historians. Therefore, there was a fundamental debate between and among Marxist historians on this. And as we know, feudalism today is a concept which is being deeply debated in Europe. There are European historians who say that this is a completely invalid concept. There are others that defend it to the hilt. The argument was based on changes in land relations in the latter half of the first millennium AD in India. The transition to feudalism lay in the system of granting land or villages primarily to Brahmins, to temples, to Buddhist monasteries, and to a few who had served the state. Since the granting of land became a focal point of the political economy, it brought about a tangible change. This became central after about the 8th, 9th centuries AD and has become a time marker for a new periodization. The discussion for and against the feudal mode opened up new perceptions about the state, the economy and society, religious activities, and other potential areas of investigation. It also brought in other non-Marxist theories of explanation. So this is one occasion where someone introduces a concept, the concept is argued, and the end result is many more concepts and much more data coming into the system of knowledge. Grants of land to religious beneficiaries led predictably to innovations in the way they organized themselves and their modes of worship. They established institutions that became powerful property holders, as we know to this day. The large number of inscriptions recording these grants provided the evidence. It is interesting that the inscriptions had been read since the 19th century, but largely for data on chronology and dynastic succession. Only in the last 50 years or so did they begin to be examined in depth for data on agrarian history and for assessing elite patronage to religious groups. This is one example of how history changes when historians ask a different set of questions. Some religious cults that had a regional base became a network of support for particular dynasties, a process that was to be common and visible at many levels. The Yadavas, for instance, in the Deccan, were both devotees and patrons of the emerging cult of Vitthala, a form of Vishnu widely worshipped in Maharashtra and parts of Karnataka. This is thought to have had its origins in the hero cult of local pastoralists, which was then incorporated into the royal cult of Vaishnavism. Why? Royal patronage of a particular religious cult meant that the geographical distribution of the cult would become an area of support for the royal patron. Sifting the activities covered by the all-inclusive label of religion and attempting to observe their social functions helps to clarify the links between social roles and religious beliefs. Religious establishments, whether Buddhist, Jain, Vaishnava or Shaiva, quite apart from their role in fostering formal religion, were sometimes channels of political intervention through their relationship with rulers. At the same time, popular religious movements, some known to deviate from or even contradict the orthodox, occupied a prominent role on the wider social canvas. Historians have argued whether the relationship between the worshipper and his deity or her deity in popular devotional worship referred to as bhakti can be viewed as a parallel to that of the peasant to his feudal lord. Were these parallel idioms, as it were. The discussion provoked by this argument throws immense light on the intricacies of both the religious and political relationships. Max Weber's idea of legitimacy being essential to status, all status has to be legitimized, in the context of political authority particularly, has received extensive interest. Even the very limited work on the Indian historical tradition indicates that the need for legitimation was one reason for creating what we today call traditions. Priests performed rituals to endow their patrons with high status and success. The patron acquires prestige through the ritual, and the priest receives a fee or a gift, a dakshina. Such relationships based on gift-giving are not just demonstrations of generosity, but are mechanisms of creating obligations between the giver and the recipient. Studies in the patterns of genealogies are providing insights into the reading of the epics and also in understanding the inscriptions of the later period. The lengthy ancestral lists of the heroes and the anti-heroes of the Mahabharata were earlier treated as uniform, but are now being seen as recording a variety of social observances. It's quite interesting, most people don't realize this, that in the family of the Pandavas, for example, you have 3 different marriage systems within 3 generations. You have Pandu acquiring Madri through bride price, you have the Pandavas indulging in fraternal polyandry, and you have Arjun indulging in the Rakshas form of marriage where he abducts Subhadra. 3 totally different social customs and systems within 3 generations. The historian just doesn't record them. The historian has to say why. Why this difference? What explains it? One doesn't know, but it's a lengthy explanation. What was earlier thought to be the unchanging character of caste has given way to realizing that degrees of upward social mobility were possible, but not widely so, and involved imitating the lifestyle of the upper castes. This process of imitating the lifestyle of the upper caste was not one always of gentle osmosis, because imitating the lifestyle of an upper caste by a lower caste can sometimes be the cause of friction, if not confrontation. And we've seen it in the world of today. It existed in the world of yesterday as well. These reorientations in the study of early Indian history were anticipated as a consequence of interdisciplinary trends, of methodological change, and of discussions on theories of explanation. Other themes have also emerged in the last couple of decades. Gender history is not just accumulating more data on the history of women. It is concerned with re-examining the position of women in social relationships, and in searching for the perspective that women had of their society. For example, it was earlier stated that women were held in high respect in ancient India, especially in the Vedic age. The evidence quoted was the narrative in the Upanishads describing the woman philosopher Gargi asking tough philosophical questions, or the Emperor Ashoka ordering that the donations of his queen Garuvaki be officially recorded. But such references sit uncomfortably alongside those referring to the substantial numbers of women domestic slaves, the dasis, gifted as wealth as stated in the Rigveda and the epics. The Buddhist Pali texts have statements about women complaining of their ill treatment because of their distinctly subordinate position. And in the legal forms of marriage discussed in the Dharmashastras, the woman was the object to be gifted, to be valued, or to be abducted. And these were all legal forms of marriage. The historian's concern is to place these statements in the context of the particular societies where they occur, which tell us much about the societies, and to observe why and how there were changes when changes occurred. One of the important avenues of change in society was when clans emerged as castes. This was a continuous and constant process in various parts of the subcontinent. The change was not simultaneous, and old forms sometimes remain as a parallel stream. But elsewhere, the origins of certain upper castes could be traced to non-caste groups who had previously had clan or occupational identities, as, for example, the clans that lived in the forest dwellers. The cultural assimilation of clans often resulted in the chiefly families taking Kshatriya status and the rest of the clan being relegated to Shudra caste status as peasants. A picture of this process can be glimpsed in the Harsha Charita of Bana, a 7th century biography of the king Harshavardhana of Kannauj. This social change required the converting of forest into fields, and an erstwhile more egalitarian society accepting the hierarchies essential to caste. A permanent supply of labor was ensured by other means, such as declaring that some groups and some occupations were so low and polluting as to make those people untouchable. The explanations for this theory provide another dimension of social history. The interest in regional history, which is now, of course, very important, grew by degrees, assisted to some extent by the creation of linguistic states from the late 1950s, superseding the more arbitrary boundaries of the erstwhile provinces of British India. The newly created states came to be treated by historians as sub-national territorial units, and the histories of these states began to be written on the pattern of the All India history. But boundaries are political markers and change with political change. Therefore, present-day boundaries very infrequently coincide with those of earlier times. The perspective of subcontinental history, conventionally viewed from the Ganges plain, has to change with the evidence now coming from regional history. For example, the history of South India is rightly much more prominent in general histories of India than it was 50 years ago. But these regional histories also have to be integrated within a larger framework. They cannot be isolated regional histories. Regional histories form patterns that sometimes differ from each other, and the variations provide interesting facets for the study of comparative history between regions. For example, the model of the 4 varnas, castes, was not the caste pattern in the entire subcontinent for all time as was maintained earlier. we still have to explain why in some periods, and quite long periods, Brahmins and Velala peasants gave shape to the history of Tamil Nadu, as some historians have thought, whereas Khatri traders dominated in the Punjab. Differences are not just diversities in regional styles. They are expressions of multiple cultural norms that cut across the assumption that all identities have always been monolithic and uniform. Let me conclude now by saying that I have attempted to give you a glimpse of a few of the changes that underlie the study and interpretation of early Indian history. To look at the early past as a historical process rather than in isolated fragments is a response to our curiosity about the past and our attempt to understand and explain it. But it also illumines our own times. This in itself is a significant justification for a greater familiarity with early Indian history. But we are often unwilling to concede this in our focused attention on the present. The past is not static. We believe that because we have created it, we can also control it. And then it becomes contested. But the sources we use have already captured the pasts that preceded them. The past, therefore, is inherently layered and has a genealogy. When we speak to the past in the sources that we use, we are tapping into points of time which have experienced their own pasts and have moved into their own futures before we have even reached out to them. And when we invoke the past, we need to ask, what are we invoking and why? Thank you.
Knowledge is not free of its context of time, and the past needs to be Knowledge is not free of its context of time, and the past needs to be reinterpreted every time historians ask different sets of questions. Thank you very much, ma'am, for coming to our Shala and for demystifying some of our early history for us. We cannot thank you enough, but we would surely like to express our gratitude. I request Professor P Bambah to present a memento to Professor Romila Thapar. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been joined by another one of our very illustrious alumni, Mr. Pawan Kumar Bansal, the Union Cabinet Minister of Parliamentary Affairs and Water Resources. He is here after taking out time from his very busy schedule just to celebrate this historic day with us. I request Mr. Bansal to please say a few words.
Very distinguished guest and renowned historian, Professor Romila Thapar ji, the Vice Chancellor, Professor Arunji, former Vice Chancellors, Professor Bambah, Professor Puri, Professor Pathak, Professor Kohli, Professor B.S. Thakur, Professor Bhandari, Professor Sirohi, ladies and gentlemen. I must first apologize for coming a little late, but very soon I realized the loss was mine. We had such a scintillating, informative and thought-provoking address by Professor Romila Thapar ji. Not being a historian, I've always felt that history is perhaps a tale of the forces of the time and of the people who happen to stand on the intersection of those forces. It's much more, as we all learn from Professor Romila Thapar ji. I think what is important for us is to grasp the lessons that history throws up for us, for the future generations. I don't know how exactly to put it. Our distinguished guests would know, but I only remember from bits and pieces that I pick up from general reading that I came across one anecdote from the life of Kautilya. He was sitting and working at his place, doing some work, writing with the lamp lit there. The Chinese ambassador was ushered in, and before Kautilya began to talk to him, he set aside his pen, kalam and the ink pot, brought another one closer to him, put off the lamp, lit another lamp. And when the Chinese ambassador asked him as to why did he do that, he said, I was doing official work before you came. Now I am meeting you in my personal capacity and I have no right to use the official, any infrastructure or anything available to me at all. It's a big lesson that we have to learn from that. I think that is how there are many things that we can pick up from history. We often wonder when we talk of India being the golden sparrow more than 2000 years back and lament at our present position with our index of poverty, hunger going down as compared to many other countries. But if we just look back and see as to what was our society like, it was an open society. People did move around. There was far more mobility than 2000 years back. Professor Romila Thapar talked of the commerce and trade at that time. Well, perhaps people came to India from all over and Indians went abroad. I for myself have seen the permanent vestiges of India's culture, India's being on the lands of Cambodia and Laos. Over 1,800, to be precise, 1,800 Shivlingams engraved on the riverbed there thousands of years back. That was how India moved forward, and that's how we acquired that strength that we had. But perhaps later, we came to believe that even crossing the seas was taboo. Anyone who crosses the seas ceases to be a true follower of his faith, and that led to our downfall, if I can understand it correctly. And therefore, what she said, what lessons she gave, that international trade, I mean, if we want our country to move forward today, we have to be more open. We have to believe in the globalization which is perhaps condemned. That is just what I would like to say. I in fact have no competence to speak at all after Professor Romila Thapar has given such thought-provoking talk to us, as I've said. We've all been benefited immensely by that. And I think there could have been a better way of celebrating our foundation day today. Under 30 years we've completed, 65 years in Pakistan and then 65 years here, and there couldn't have been a better way, more appropriate and befitting way than having this foundation day lecture by Romila Thapar, which we all have been enriched by.
I think I must join you all in thanking her for this. And as an alumnus of the university, I do feel proud that we have people like her. And another lesson perhaps we have to learn from her was, from her life, that twice she declined the Padma Vibhushan. People go further. When we believe that any award perhaps is the result of some marketing, here was a case where she declined, saying that it had nothing to do with her professional career and therefore she didn't accept that. That's what we learn from the historian herself. I thank her and thank you all for giving this opportunity to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. I request our registrar, Professor A.K. Bhandari, to honor Mr. Pawan Kumar Bansal. A small memento. Thank you so much, sir. I request the Dean Alumni Relations, Professor Arun Grover, to present the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon to all. As we come to an end to this absolutely awesome morning, it is my proud privilege and very pleasant duty to propose a formal vote of thanks. First and foremost, a warm and heartfelt thank you from one and all at Panjab University to Professor Romila Thapar for conceding to our request to deliver the first Panjab University Foundation Day lecture, and more so for such a superb and enlightening insight and journey through the history of our great country. I also extend our sincere thanks to Shri Pawan Kumar Bansal ji, Union Cabinet Minister for Parliamentary Affairs and Water Resources, for sparing his valuable time to grace this historic occasion of the Panjab University Foundation Day and offer his most valued comments and observations, which I am sure will help Panjab University to scale greater heights. I would like to thank Professor P Bambah, former Vice Chancellor, for agreeing to preside over the Foundation Day lecture. A very special thanks to our esteemed Vice Chancellor, Professor Arun Kumar Grover, who has been the inspiration behind this event. The idea of holding the Panjab University Foundation Day came from him, and it has been his guidance and dedication that has made it actually happen, the beginning of a wonderful tradition. Also, I would like to thank Professor R.K. Kohli, Dean University Instruction, Professor A.K. Bhandari, Registrar, and Mr. R.L. Kapoor, Secretary to Vice Chancellor, who have been extremely supportive at each step of the organization process. A deep sense of gratitude for Professor B.S. Brar, Chairman, Steering Committee for the Panjab University Foundation Day, who has been always there at every step of the way from planning to realization. I would like to thank all members of the Steering Committee, the conveners and members of the working committees, and the coordinator of the Foundation Day lecture, Professor Devi Sirohi, for their total cooperation and dedication. A special thanks is also due to the architect advisor, architect and his team for the translation of the concept of a university monument into a design, and the Exian for having the plaque prepared at very short notice. I would also like to thank the media personnel for giving wide coverage to this historic occasion. All our student volunteers who have worked relentlessly behind the scenes to make this event a success deserve a special thanks, as does the entire administrative staff who have provided all the needed support. Last but not least, I would like to thank this wonderful audience who have joined us this morning and with whom we share the pride and joy of the Panjab University Foundation Day. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please join us for lunch, and please return for the next part of our program, which is a panel discussion on the vision of Punjab University at 3:15 p.m. Thanks a lot. 3 o'clock. Please return at 3 o'clock for the panel discussion.